Welcome to the Power Trends podcast, produced by the New York Independent System Operator, where we discuss energy planning, public policy, and other issues affecting New York's power grid.
Hello and welcome to another Power Trends podcast. This is Kevin Lanahan, Vice President, External Affairs, Corporate Communications at the New York Independent System Operator. Very pleased and excited to be talking today with Rana Mukerji, who is Senior Vice President, Market Structures for the New York Independent System Operator. He joined the NYISO way back in May 2006. Probably has had the biggest imprint on market design for the New York Independent System Operator of anybody that is affiliated with the organization. Rana, thanks for joining us here today.
Well, thanks, Kevin. It's a pleasure to be here and talk about markets.
Yeah, we want to talk about market design, your experience with the New York markets, but how you also came to be involved in this industry. Let's cover a little bit more about your history.
Well, I came from India. First plane ride was to RPI in Troy, New York.
The very first time you set foot in the States was to go to RPI.
Yes, I got a full ride in RPI to do graduate school. And my first plane ride from Calcutta, India to New York City, and took a bus to Troy, New York.
Amazing.
And I did electric power engineering. And electric power engineering in RPI was very equipment focused. So they were sponsored by GE and Westinghouse. So I did an MBA. So I got my economics kind of grounding. And my power professors were very disappointed that I didn't do a PhD. I did an MBA. But then I worked for a small consulting company. Then I worked for GE. And I worked in their systems consulting group in Schenectady. I was an engineer doing simulations. In 1992, Bill Hogan, who's a professor at Harvard at that time, he was one of the principal conceptual architects of deregulation. And he came to GE with us to solve a technical problem. He was calculating what is called spot prices, which is what the price would be at a particular location in the network. He wanted GE to calculate it.
So Bill Hogan, Harvard professor, an economist back in the day prior to what we call deregulation and the evolution of competitive marketplace. Mm-hmm. He goes to GE and you're having discussions with him.
Correct. And you have to realize that deregulation started with the breakup of AT&T in the 80s. It started with communication, then airlines, then trucking, transportation, and natural gas. And then people said, why not electricity? And electricity is more complex. So there was a guy from MIT, actually, his name was Fred Schweppe. He wrote a big paper on spot prices and he passed away. And Bill Hogan became the leading academic, saying that how electricity market could be deregulated. Bill Hogan's customer was GPU, General Public Utilities. It was a young engineer by the name of Andy Ott who came to GE with RPI, who was their customer. They were trying to see what GPU's generators would fare if the markets became competitive and deregulated, how the generators would be competitive or not. In fact, there was a big fear among utilities that generators would become stranded because they were no longer competitive.
Stranded, let's explain that for folks listening.
So
stranded costs.
So in the early 90s, technology changed. Before, the larger the plant you built, the cheaper the per unit cost of electricity would be. In the 90s, there was this new technology, combined cycle units, which could be relatively modular. A few hundred megawatts, they could be located close to a load center. And they would be more competitive than the large nuclear and steam plants who were legacy plants. And they would some of them had bad locations, bad investments. So you remember Shoreham. And
a lot of people still remember Shoreham.
So you have new plants now, combined cycle, which are low cost, close to the customer's side, and more competitive than power plants. So in fact, in New York, upstate plant could be built by industrial, and all-in costs would be lower than the wholesale rate from the utility. That's the stranded cost aspect. That's why Bill Hogan and others were trying to see how you could have a competitive markets to drive the future. And that's why GPU was worried of how their units would fare.
So we boil some of this down. Some of the problem is cost.
Correct.
But then also trying to address what we'll say is the inelasticity part of the issue.
What happened was the electricity rates, the costs which were deemed prudent of the investments which were made, like the big nuclear plants which were delayed and other big plants which were in wrong locations or built prematurely, were all reflected in the rates.
Right.
So the electricity rates were higher than what you could build a new plant. So that was the fundamental issue at that time, which really drove deregulation. And the promise of deregulation was lower costs and more innovation.
Right. Okay, so then what? Back to you. You go from General Electric to ABB.
The meeting with Bill Hogan kind of sparked my career. So my simulation business, and because Bill Hogan was doing all the simulations, in fact, New York was looking at how a competitive market works. GE did a lot of simulations on the behalf of New York transmission owners to see how a potential ISO would work. GE had $9 billion of investments through GE Capital, through independent power producers, and they were also worried about how much these plants will work. So I got promoted from basically a senior engineer to a manager to the general manager of the consulting group. And the funny thing was Jack Welch, who was the head of GE, we were the smallest profit center in power systems. So he used to call me the popcorn stand. So at that time I was young and I wanted to run a bigger business. So ABB came calling. So I went to work for ABB into their asset management and services business.
About what year was this now?
This was 1999.
Okay. So just when the ISO markets were being built.
Being formed. So I went to ABB, I ran their services. I got promoted to senior VP at ABB. I was in Zurich, but then I saw it's not intellectually challenging. I had service units in 30 countries, but all I was looking for, the biggest intellectually exciting positive part of it, like IBM does, outsource services. And then I started looking at the ISOs, and I said that it would be great to join an ISO to actually design and be part of the markets I helped work on when I worked in the GE consulting. So then I met an acquaintance of mine, Belinda Thornton, who was head of market monitoring in the ISO, and she said the VP of markets position is open, and the rest is history.
So this is, and so now we're at about 2006, correct? So maybe it would help to first establish what the markets are. You have capacity markets, ancillary markets, and energy markets. In a nutshell, help for folks that may not know, what are the distinctions and the differences, but then also how do these three markets work together to achieve, like you said, reliability and efficiency?
Okay. So energy market procures and prices what consumers consume. That's the electricity that keeps your lights on and runs your appliances and so on. And again, the markets are, as the demand rises, you need more supply, the prices rise, and that's the basic balancing supply and demand. But the energy market also does another fundamental thing, which is ancillary services, which are called reserves. These things basically form up the grid and lets it run through disturbances. Reserves protect the grid from unexpected outages. Basically, the biggest plant in New York is the 9 Mile 2 nuclear unit. So if a big unit goes out, the grid instantly has to respond because there is no big storage in the electric grid. Everything has to be balanced second by second, supply and demand. So reserves are generators who are being held back to meet a contingency. Regulation is even shorter time frame. Every 6 seconds, we make sure that supply and demand is met. Because if you don't meet that, our frequency goes down. 60 hertz, which is the frequency of the power grid, which keeps the grid
needs to be maintained.
Which has to stay rock solid. That's very close to 60 all the time, which maintains the stability of the whole Eastern interconnection. You need regulation services to maintain that. So we in the energy market procure energy, which runs the appliances and the lighting and all the customer uses, and also grid firming services, just as regulation and reserves, to make sure that the grid is secure and firm. What's happening today is that we have a lot of renewables, a lot of solar, wind, which are intermittent, and the grid firming services are becoming more important because we are looking now at procuring these grid services where they are needed. If wind is locating in New York City, Long Island, you have to make sure there's enough backup services there. And the intermittency makes not only energy important, but the ancillary services role. The ancillary services become a more important component. Now, the capacity market is directly related to maintaining sufficient resources to keep the lights on.
But when you arrive in 2006, markets in that snapshot versus today in terms of changes, technology, policies, what we're seeing from a reliability perspective. So let's talk a little bit about availability as an important component for helping the grid run, but then also for the stability of the markets, because you're diving into capacity markets, and this is really important.
Right. So the grid is essential. People cannot live. So when we did markets, we said markets what mechanism do we have in the markets to make sure there's sufficient resources to keep the lights on? So we said we need a capacity market to ensure that there will be the same level of reserves as the utility plan system maintained. So essentially, capacity market procures resources to meet a planning standard. So the planning standard in New York is set by the New York State Reliability Council. They do simulations which are based on Monte Carlo analysis, which looks at many, many different futures. They look at 2,000 plus cases of generators being forced out and see how much resources do we need to have a very high level of confidence. And their confidence level is measured as one occurrence in 10 years. You cannot be perfect. And very, very large quantities of generators, there's a small probability of not meeting supply and demand. But their level of confidence is one instance of not having sufficient resources in 10 years. So that's a construct. So what we do is in the capacity market, we procure enough resources to meet that reliability standard. In some markets, at least in Australia when they started, there was no capacity market. You could do it with just energy market, but it leads to a lot of volatility. And what happens is that the generators would recover their fixed costs during periods of scarcity. So the prices when highest days of summer or when resources are not getting fuel in the winter, the generators bid up their offers into the market and they recoup their fixed costs of investments.
So fair to say, if we were to boil this down, that energy and ancillary markets are taking care of needs that are in real time.
Correct.
Capacity markets are trying to account for what will happen in the future.
Yes.
And trying to account for unexpected events like outages of transmission lines, generators going offline,
right,
extreme weather, et cetera. And that's a difficult thing to try and forecast and predict, but you need to have enough resources in the system to meet whatever those unexpected
So absolutely right, Kevin. So essentially, capacity market is geared towards procuring resources. So you have enough iron in the ground to meet your anticipated needs of the system. So you have a fair confidence of maintaining reliability. Now, energy market ensures, or rather makes sure that it gives incentives that the resources respond in real time. Because just having a generator doesn't get you the response you need in real time. In energy market is where the rubber hits the road. So when the load is picking up, you should have units which are able to follow the load. So energy market is a fast-moving, second-by-second event, which is priced in the market.
Right.
But capacity market just makes sure that you have enough resources on the ground to keep it. So energy market is all about performance. Capacity market is all about assurance.
Can we say assurance equals reliability?
Yes, assurance, so that you have the assurance that you have enough resources on the ground to meet reliability.
Puts a premium on the ability to be there when we need them.
Yes.
All right. So we were talking a lot about how the markets are changing to accommodate the influx of renewables.
Yeah.
And what are some of the dynamics that we're seeing today on the system and how markets are dealing with those changes?
Well, the system is changing profoundly. Just to show you how the system grew over the last 100 years.
Yeah.
The first house in New York which was electrified was JP Morgan's house. And it had its own coal plant, essentially, in the premises. It ran from in the morning till like 9 p.m. And that was the first house that was electrified. Slowly that grew into the Edison Electric companies. So it grew as cities, then cities interconnected because it was cheaper to interconnect so that you could beat out outages of, you could ride through outages of plants. So this interconnected grid grew over the last 100 years, but it was based on what we call central station engineering. So large power plants, and it was driven by economies of scale. As we progressed through the electrification, which starts through, after the Second World War, the Hoover Dam, and have everybody have electricity. So larger the plant, cheaper it was. So we built large coal plants, and then it went to nuclear plants. When we started the market in 1999, and the bulk of the energy in New York was produced by about 500 central station power stands. The biggest plant was Big Alice, Ravenswood 3 in New York City. 9 Mile 2 was the biggest
The
nuclear
Niagara project out west.
The Niagara project, the hydro project, those were the big plans, and it goes all the way down to like 100 megawatt, 80 megawatt gas turbines as low to 20 megawatt diesel gensets.
And all of these machines and all of these units are serving demand.
Demand and coordinated by the operators.
Right.
Now, what's happening is today is because the transition to a decarbonized economy, we are building a lot of solar, onshore wind, offshore wind. And to back up the intermittency, we are also building storage. The other thing that's happening is demand is getting into the act. So we used to say that demand was very predictable. People got up, turned their coffee makers on, and demand was lowest at 2 a.m. in the night, dead of night, and the demand was highest in the afternoon at 2 p.m., 3 p.m., and then it started going down when people went home from work and wound down. So it was a very predictable demand. But today, the industrials have been doing it for a long time, trying to tailor their demand to get the most economic value from the utility company. But with so smart appliances, and smart home management systems, even residential companies can get into the act so that they can do two things. They can participate in the market as a demand response, or they might have solar arrays in their roofs. They might have Tesla Powerwalls in their garages, and they might want to participate in the grid directly through aggregation. So now what we have is the operators are used to coordinating the operation of 500 central power plants. We now add many thousands of megawatts of wind and solar. Some of the solar is residential. And then we have consumers participating through demand response. So our job gets much more complex in terms of systems, in terms of IT, in terms of people. So it's going to be a vastly more complex grid, but it is going to really drive the decarbonization. In fact, people say that electrification is the key to decarbonization of the entire economy. So we're having electric transportation, electric heating, more and more electrification of industry. So this is a very, very exciting time for the industry.
So what's happening inside of the capacity markets? Is it fair or accurate to say that they are beginning to reflect the behavior and the dynamics inside of the capacity market are reflecting what's happening in state policy?
So the capacity market's core mission remains the same: procure enough resources to keep the lights on. But all resources are not the same today. So the reliability value of a gas turbine would be very close to its nameplate rating. So a 100 megawatt gas turbine would be very close to 100 megawatts in terms of its contribution to reliability, because the only time the gas turbine is not available is when it breaks down, which is less than sometimes around 5% of the year. So a 100 megawatt gas turbine could be worth 95 megawatts in terms of reliability.
When you say nameplate, this is the upper potential?
Upper potential. If you brush off the suit and you get what's written on the manufacturer, it'll say it's a 100 megawatt gas turbine. Yeah. But a wind turbine, it's not available all the time. The wind doesn't blow all the time. In fact, the reliability value of an onshore wind plant is about 25%. Offshore is about 40%. Solar is about 40%. Batteries, 4-hour batteries worth about 70%. 2 hours, maybe 30%. It takes 8 or 10 hours to get to 100%. So capacity market, all resources are not the same. So we are doing a process called capacity accreditation, which values resources based on their reliability contribution and compensates them based on reliability contribution. So interesting thing happens, because as you have more renewables, you have more intermittency.
Right.
As you have more intermittency, you need to procure more resources to balance that. Now, if you look at solar.
And it could be building a lot of wind and a lot of solar all over the grid, so that where it can't be producing because the sun is under cloud cover, somewhere else it does. But that doesn't solve the entire equation of
the reliability. For example, if you build solar starts off at 40% of nameplate in terms of reliability value, which is great. But as you add more and more solar, what it does is that it depresses the peak in the afternoon, which is also great, till if you keep on adding solar, the afternoon is no longer the peak load. The peak load has now shifted to the evening.
Especially in winter?
Especially in the winter. So adding more solar doesn't give you any more reliability at that point. You have to add something else, which is storage. So capacity accreditation gives you that indication. So that, say that to meet reliability If you add more solar, you're not going to get any more reliability, but the value of storage for reliability is better. So the storage will get compensated more. Now, today, the state's goal is 70% renewable by 2030. And what that means is that you'll have much more solar, much more wind, and much more storage. And what's happening is that the conventional fleet, most importantly gas turbines, which can be started quicker and follow demand very quickly, they form up the grid. So we can get to 70% renewable by 2030 by building lots of solar, a lot of wind, and retaining needed amounts of conventional generation to back up this. And the capacity market helps to devise the needed mix, because the capacity market, by doing accreditation, we will procure enough megawatts which have a good certainty of keeping the lights on.
So things become more complex from a pricing perspective, would you say? But the capacity market's responsibility is to show some strong price signals to create the incentive for all of these units.
Yes, prices go up when you don't have enough resources. So if you retire a whole lot of conventional units, prices will go up. And say you add lots of solar to replace that.
Right.
At one point, your prices won't go down anymore because solar is not having any reliability effect. So you should put something else like batteries. In the future, when we go 100% carbon free, we would need something called, my planning colleague Zach Smith says, dispatchable energy free, emission free resources, DFRs, which could be hydrogen-based generation, could be long-term storage, could be renewable natural gas, could be a whole number of things. But the capacity market is geared towards procuring resources which will give us a very fair certainty of keeping the lights on.
So give us an overview of what some of the necessary changes are going to be in the capacity market, but then also the energy market and extend to the ancillary markets. The markets have to evolve because things are changing so quickly.
Yes. So first of all, the markets are designed to give enough revenues to the needed resources. So when you add lots and lots of wind and solar, we will see exit of conventional units. You don't need all of them,
right?
But you need sufficient amounts of them to form up the intermittency. So in the energy market, what we see is that because the resources we are adding are very intermittent, the role of these grid forming products, which is reserves and regulation, becomes very important. Not only are they important, it is important to figure out where you need them and how much you need them.
Okay, yeah, that's another important thing that you should highlight. Where on the system these resources are necessary from a reliability and deliverability point of view.
So deliverability is that if you cannot get the energy which is needed in Long Island cannot get there from Albany, you better have some reserves or resources in Long Island, for example. So in the energy market, especially if you're putting a lot of offshore wind, the state wants to build 9,000 megawatts at least offshore, and they're going to sink in Long Island and New York City. The offshore wind has a lot of variability, even minute-to-minute variability in the output that it's hard to predict. If you could predict what the offshore wind is going to produce 100%, you could position the system. But you cannot ever predict it at very high level of accuracy. So you have...
And not to get too far off on this, but there are studies out there that show how many days of wind lulls there are for certain periods of time in that part of the Long Island Sound.
Yes, there's a study with long-range data that we've looked at. The outlier was we were out of wind for like 84 hours, which is more than 3 days. So that has to be backed up. But there are other things. There's variability of wind. There's variability of wind.
And it's not always 40 miles an hour.
Yes, correct. It's not always 40 miles an hour. If you have 9,000 of that blowing, even 5 minutes variability could be a few hundred megawatts. And that has to be formed up by something. By today, it's conventional units. Tomorrow, it will be these dispatchable emission-free resources if you have totally decarbonized. But then we have to find out how much of these reserves you need and where you procure them. If resources in New York City can reach Long Island, because there's transmission headroom in that, we are building transmission in New York now. So we have to determine how much reserves you need and where you need them. So we'll need them in Long Island, we'll need it in New York City, we'll need it in Lower Hudson Valley, and we need it fully for the whole control area. But we have to look at, we control areas, all of New York, which is essentially under our systems operators' control. So we have to figure out how much you need, where you need them, and how you price them. Because for the conventional resources or in the future, these DFERs, these are where they provide this critical service of firming up the grid. So that's where we're working on the energy market.
Okay. So you've said the ancillary markets will be the main event.
Yes.
What do you mean by that?
So today, a lot of the revenues of a generator comes from the energy market. So if a generator is efficient, it gets what is called the inframarginal revenue, which essentially the market price is 100 and my costs are 50. I get $50 from every hour for being efficient. Now, what's happening is that a lot of times the market price is now going to be set by basically zero cost resources. The renewable resources doesn't have fuel costs. So there's no cost for solar or wind on terms of variable costs, which is to set a lot of the price. So
all of their costs are maintenance and
the large capital costs.
Yeah.
So you have the energy market price are trending down because a lot of times the price is still set by gas. But as you have more zero variable cost resources, the energy price will be depressed. And then the premium will be on grid firming services. Like you have to start up, you have to ramp, you have to have reserves to back up the intermittency, and you have to meet the frequency requirements which are met by regulation.
This is what you were talking about earlier.
So,
if the wind speeds are up and down, how do you fill in?
So the grid firming services are very related to maintaining the security and reliability of the grid. So that becomes the main event. The price will be set by the consumer to reduce their demand. Because in the other paradigm which is happening, generators used to be dispatched to follow demand. Now the demand is smart. The demand will also follow generation.
Demand meaning consumption.
Consumption. So if the consumption is saying it's worth it for me to spend $100 for a megawatt at this hour and only $50 the other hours. So in the end of the day, the consumption can set the price.
All right, so we've tackled a lot here.
Yeah.
Let's ask the difficult question, but the one that's, I think, pretty obvious and that a lot of listeners are going to want to hear about from you. So our markets for roughly 23 years have existed and promoted efficiency and reliability, also an advance in technology and driving down emissions, right? You've told us here today, competition rewards the most efficient unit, so then other units want to follow so that they can also get compensated inside of the competitive marketplace. Now we have a great amount of activity by the state, and we have New York State Energy Research Development Authority, which is rewarding renewable developers to build projects that connect to the system. So how do our markets coexist as the state continues to sign these contracts for developers to produce energy?
Well, one of the things the state is doing is writing these renewable energy credit REC contracts to sign up resources. And that's driving the entry of the solar and the wind, and to some extent storage as well. So now that is not completely incompatible with markets, because in markets, we only value reliability and we value cost. We don't have an environmental component to the market. So what the NYSERDA REC contracts are doing is that I call it it's a top-up payment to make these resources competitive with conventional units. So the NYSERDA REC contracts are allowing wind and solar to be competitive so that they can enter the market. But the markets are still giving them a lot of signals of how to perform in the energy market. And secondly, and more importantly, where to locate. Because you don't want to locate a wind plant where it's going to displace hydro. So the prices are going to not be as good in those areas where there's a lot of renewables. The prices could be zero and sometimes it could be negative.
This is going back to what you were saying before, locating resources close to the load in order to serve the reliability function, but then also make sure there's a healthy mix.
Yes, a lot of the renewables are not close to the load, but we still give locational prices there. So everybody, even the NYSERDA contracts, are dependent on what the resources need. They run a competitive auction on the resources. So if a resource is locating where the prices are already low, they'll need more of a contract. In fact, they will not get selected by NYSERDA. So our markets still drive some of the occasional decisions, even through the REC contracts. These resources also need energy market and capacity market revenues to be viable. So they also drive the performance of the real-time performance. So I feel that the NYISO contracts in REC are compatible with the markets. And in the future, as we build more wind in scale, the hope is that they would not need a lot of subsidies. They will be competitive. Today, 4-hour batteries are pretty close to a gas turbine in terms of cost.
So let's take it a couple steps further, because I can anticipate some questions from listeners saying, okay, we've heard from Rana who's saying that the influx of renewables who have zero fuel costs are depressing the energy market prices. And we're talking and seeing about the exit of conventional resources from the markets. So talk to us about that kind of pressure and tension inside of our markets.
So two things which are happening is we're having a lot of renewable resources come in. Energy prices are going down. Ancillary services prices are going up and are more needed because what's happening, the system is becoming more volatile, and the premium is on flexibility and the ability to follow load, the ability to start up when you need it to, and the ability to form up the system. So what we've done in our markets, we are continually redefining where we want to procure the reserves. We are repricing the reserves to make it more attractive for resources to actually perform to get those reserve pricing.
Rewarding the flexibility. So fair compensation for the reliability contribution, but also enough to ensure that these units that we've relied on for decades don't leave the system prematurely.
So as you build out solar and wind and renewables, you will have retirements, and reliable retirements are needed and economically efficient. But if you prematurely retire them, we might have a reliability problem. And the market prices will reflect that. And the accreditation that we are doing helps policymakers determine what you need to replace a retirement.
So Zach, you mentioned Zach Smith has been on the podcast a couple of times, and fairly concerned about, from a planning perspective, having enough units to serve reliability in the future. We have enough confidence that the markets are going to help incentivize the retention of the units that we need, or what's your perspective on that?
The markets are designed to do that. The markets are designed to procure enough resources to meet a reliability need. So to that, the key is accreditation. That's why we are so focused on doing the capacity accreditation rate, because the nameplate rating, or basically what the maximum rating of a unit is no longer a good indication of the reliability value. So the reliability value is based on what the planning engineers call the load carrying capability. So a 100 megawatt gas turbine can carry 95 megawatts of additional load or demand. A wind plant might only be able to carry 25 megawatts of additional demand. So when we procure the amount of resources we need to meet the reliability standard, which is one occurrence in 10 years, our capacity market will procure that.
Let's shift a bit and talk about DER and the value and the contribution of DER, especially in the shoulder seasons. Like, in the early spring, we were seeing it looked to be a big contribution relative terms from behind the meter solar. But that's not always going to be there. But your thoughts on moving forward, that the smaller installations and how to value appropriately DER. So
the DER, this distributed energy resources, is proliferating. So the two things are happening. Central stations are there, a lot of renewables, and some of the renewables are rooftop solar, and they can be coupled with batteries as well. And then there are industrial users who can curtail their demand based on what the needs are. And then there could be residential owners who now have the smart homes who can actually curtail their usage or tailor their usage according to needs. For distributed resources, which are small, the key to the wholesale market is aggregation, because they can aggregate a number of resources. And in some cases, in residential, it could be hundreds of resources and offer into the market.
So this is sort of in a virtual sense, counting where these installations are and bringing them together as if they're a small generating unit. So going all the way back to the beginning of our conversation, where we were talking about Bill Hogan and the concept and the theory of a future grid and how it was going to work. Now we're addressing that idea that demand was inelastic from the other set of realities that we have in modern day.
Yeah, Kevin, you hit the nail on the head. Yes, the demand can be elastic, and the elasticity of demand will really aid in decarbonization. because the more elastic the demand, easier it is to decarbonize and less the need for these mysterious dispatchable emission-free resources to keep the grid reliable and secure.
So
in fact,
much more dynamic system.
yeah, that's why I call it as the last frontier in market design. We worked on the supply side frontier for 20 years. Now we go into the demand side frontier. It is hard because there's lots of these distribution operators, but that's a tremendous potential to help us decarbonize.
So one takeaway I hear from you is that markets not only can, but are essential to facilitating this transition to decarbonization.
Absolutely. The markets can lead to the most efficient path to decarbonization. And that's the beauty of markets, because the markets give you the signals of what's working. And I gave you the example of solar, because at one point, if you keep on building solar, you don't get any reliability value. So at some point, you would have to stop overbuilding solar, build something else. If you look at the market signals, it helps you come up with the right mix of zero carbon resources, which gets you to the goal. So that is the beauty of markets. Even if you have RECs, because RECs are tailored to work with markets.
From time to time, there are questions about something called the uniform clearing price. This is a fundamental mechanism within the markets to value certain resources and meet what's called the necessary bid stack. Maybe you can just explain why we use the uniform clearing price and what the leading economists have said over the years.
So the uniform clearing price is a bedrock of how we actually dispatch the system. So when you do a dispatch, you essentially look at all the bids, which are based on variable cost, and variable cost is usually fuel-based. And we procure enough resources to meet our demand for that particular hour or 5-minute interval. So the price is based on the variable cost needed to supply the next increment of demand. So that sets the price. Now, a lot of times, if there's a lot of renewables and natural gas resources, the next increment of demand will be supplied by natural gas or whatever fuel is driving the variable cost. Now, that's the uniform clearing price. Now, everybody gets that uniform clearing price.
Right.
And the people who are low cost could be a more efficient gas turbine. It could be renewable resources with zero variable cost. They get what we call the inframarginal revenue. So the uniform price is 100 and your variable cost is 0, you're going to get all $100 into your pocket. However, if you do not do the uniform clearing price based approach, you will not get efficient dispatch because people will play with their variable costs and you will not get the least mix of units to meet your next level of demand. That's how we got the efficiency in the market in the first place. We had 11,600 megawatts of generators who have exited New York, replaced by over 12,000 megawatts of more efficient units. That's driven by our uniform clearing price kind of mechanism where efficiency is rewarded.
The alternative we hear often is pay as bid. Why not pay every unit whatever they offer in that particular auction or at that particular time?
So what happens that you pay as bid, you try to guess what's the most I can get away with and still get selected. So it becomes the guessing game of what's the highest cost I can bid into the market and still get selected.
So actually not good for consumers.
And we ran simulations at Cornell University about 15 years ago, having people simulate this behavior with uniform clearing prices. There's a paper I wrote with Sue Tierney, which is in the Public Utilities Fortnightly, and 2 professors in Cornell, which showed that by trying to guess what the bid should be, they get to a more inefficient dispatch and sometimes higher than what a uniform clearing price would do.
So our markets are built, this is generally speaking, to protect the customer from undue risk. Is that fair and accurate?
Yeah, the uniform clearing price mechanism gets you to the lowest cost dispatch. Plus, it gives you a mechanism to recover your fixed costs and have incentives for further investment. So the other thing is that your uniform clearing price is not based on anything that you can dream of. It's based on your variable costs. First of all, we have very strict market monitoring of markets continuously to make sure that variable costs are offered into the market.
Excellent. So when you talk about the decisions that developers are going to make to invest in the state, really our markets work to protect consumers from the risk that developers may be taking with any particular project. That's all on the developer and not placed on the consumer in our markets.
That's correct. One of the things that happened with markets was the risk of a project not being economically viable got transferred from the consumer, which is ratepayers, to the developer.
Let's talk about Shoreham again, right?
And some of these investments have not worked out well for the developer. They were either premature, where they read the market dynamics wrong, or they were in the wrong place. And these developers have got bankrupt and sold their assets for sometimes pennies to the dollars. And by driving out the inefficient plants, which happen to be the dirty plants, we got a lot of environmental benefits, though environmental aspects were not directly baked into the market. We've seen that carbon emissions reduced by over 40% because all the coal plants and the oil plants got retired in New York. And we had dramatic decreases in SOx, the sulfur dioxide and the nitrogen dioxide, which both reduced by over 90%. So environmental attributes were not baked into the markets, but just the drive to efficiency got tremendous environmental benefits.
Rana, thanks for a great conversation. We appreciate all your time and would like to have you back because these issues and these questions are so dynamic with all the changes that are happening. So thanks again. It's been really interesting.
Thanks, Kevin. We can talk about markets all day long, but this was great. Thanks.
Thank you for joining us. As a reminder, the New York Independent System Operator, NYISO for short, is responsible for reliably managing New York's power grid and energy markets and providing independent data to policymakers and the public. For more independent info, please visit the NYISO blog at www.nyiso.com/blog.